install and configure VMware ESXi. All right, so in that last nugget, we completed the installation of vCenter Server, and we've got the vSphere client up and running on our little environment here. But that really doesn't get us very far because ESXi is really kind of the workhorse of a VMware environment. Now in this nugget, what we're going to do is get ESXi up and running. We're going to go through the installation of an ESXi host, and then once we've got that the initial install of ESXi complete, we're going to pull that ESXi host into the vCenter server instance that we just created. Doing so involves verifying its thumbprint and creating an initial data center in vCenter server. When we do that, also we've got a couple of configurations in not only the ESXi host, but also in the vSphere client that we need to do in order to prepare ESXi for what we're going to be doing a little bit down the road. Now, one thing you'll notice is that the print on this screen is going to be just a little bit smaller than what you're used to. When you install ESXi in version 5, it does so in 1024 by 768 mode, and most of the recording for this series is done in 800 by 600. So I'll apologize up front because I need to be able to show you all of the pieces that are necessary so that you can see ESXi in its native mode. What I want to do at this point, however, is really walk through the entire process that you'll be going through to complete the install of an interactive mode installation of ESXi. We will do so here by first minimizing this, and before I actually get to that point, I want to show you what ESXi looks like once the install has been completed. You'll see here I have an ESXi version 5 host here. It's build 469.512. I've got 4 gigs of memory associated with it, and I'm running on an Intel Core i7-2600. Now what's important here is the fact that I'm actually running this ESXi host on top of VMware Workstation. So I have a workstation environment set up, and ESXi is running in a nested hypervisor environment on top of VMware Workstation. This host is ESX2. And it's already been configured and set to 192.168.0.203, just to give you an idea of what this will look like once we get to the completion of the ESXi installation. Creating a new ESXi instance, however, happens here under the File, New, and Virtual Machine location here inside of VMware Workstation. Now, although most of that was off of the screen so you couldn't see it, what's important to know is the fact that it's brought up the new Virtual Machine wizard. And if you've worked with Workstation for any period of time, you're familiar with this wizard. It's what you need to do to create any new virtual machine inside of VMware Workstation. I'm going to choose next here to create a custom new VM, and in this case, this VM obviously is going to be that new ESXi host. I'm going to set my hardware compatibility to the highest level that's possible for me. In this case, it's version 6.5 through version 7. If you end up with a newer version of VMware Workstation that supports version 8, well then go ahead and set that to version 8. If I choose the next button here, I can choose the installer disk image file that I'm looking for. And if I hit the browse button here, you'll see what I'm looking for is the VMware VMvisor installer. Now, version 5, and in my case, it's build 469.512. This is actually the ISO file that corresponds to the DVD you would use for installing ESXi. And obviously, it has to be in the drive so that we can actually boot and install ESXi from the virtual disk. Now, if I choose the next button here, I have to select a guest operating system. If you've built Microsoft Windows virtual machines before, then you've selected the top button up here. What we're doing down here is a VMware ESX operating system. Our version in this case is set to ESX Server 4, and that's mainly because this version of Workstation was built before the release of ESX Server 5. Now, if your version includes ESX Server 5, go ahead and select that here, but you're going to be all right with ESX Server 4 in this case. Let me go ahead and hit the next button here, and I'm going to name this virtual machine esx1.company.pri, and I want to store this in the location on my desktop where I've actually been installing all of these virtual machines here in this little folder. Now, esx1.company.pri has a few more configurations, not the least of which is the number of processors that are available. Most virtual machines you want to start out with just a single processor and a single core. However, ESXi does have a requirement that you have a minimum of 1 processor and 2 cores per processor. If you install it in this way, you'll actually eliminate a little error message that you would get a little bit down the road. So make sure you've got 1 processor and 2 cores per processor if you're doing this on top of VMware Workstation. You also have to identify a minimum amount of memory for this virtual machine. I requires a minimum of 2 gigs of RAM just to get itself up and running. Now this 2 gigs of RAM will allow ESXi to actually boot, but it doesn't really provide much in the way of extra memory so that you can run virtual machines on top of that booted ESXi instance. And so I'm actually going to double the amount of RAM that I'm providing to 4 gigs of RAM, and that gives me a little bit of buffer space so that I can run a couple of small virtual machines as demonstrations for future videos in this series. You will, like I said, have to have a minimum of 2 gigs of RAM, but if you want to do much more than just power on ESXi, I'd set it to 3 or 4. I choose the next button here, and I'm going to select Bridged Networking. If you want to actually isolate your ESX eval environment from your production environment, you might use Network Address Translation or Host-Only Networking. I'll choose the defaults here for my SCSI controller for creating a new virtual disk of type SCSI here and setting the maximum disk size to the default of 40 gigs, and also for setting the disk file name here at this point. Now, before you actually go to power on the virtual machine and start the ESXi installation, there's a couple of hardware customizations that you're going to want to do. The first of which is to eliminate the devices that are really unnecessary for use in the I environment. The first of which is this floppy disk here that you don't really need, nor do you need the USB controller. And we'll just get rid of them so that they're not there and don't cause any conflicts down the road. I also want to make sure that my display graphics, my 3D graphics, have been accelerated at this point, and I want to add in a couple of additional network adapters, in my case in bridged mode, because I may actually need to use these network adapters to segregate out my network traffic when I get to the networking sections, the networking nuggets a little bit further along in this series. You'll see further along having these additional network adapters just provides you more flexibility for making different configurations and for splitting up the different kinds of network traffic that we'll be using in a future nugget. At this point, I'm actually ready to begin the installation, so let me click the OK button here and then choose Finish, and you'll see that our ESX1 instance begins powering on. There's the VMware boot screen, and you can see the ESXi standard installer here from the boot menu. I'll hit the OK button here, or the Enter button, to begin the installation, and then again to start the automatic boot. And it's going to go through a series of loading different modules that are required to get ESXi running. Now at this point you should see that we're loading some of the final modules that are required in order to get the ESXi installer up and running. This installation is in many ways an appliance. There are not a lot of things that are required to get I up and running. The majority of those things that are required are just actually getting the installation running, and then obviously getting the ESXi management network connection hooked up so that it can talk to vCenter server. The vast majority of settings that need to be configured are actually done from within vCenter server. All that we need to do here within the console is really just getting ESXi up and running and then those network pieces ready to go. If I hit Enter and F11 here, that'll take me through some of the initial screens like the end user license agreement. Then I'm going to go scan for those available devices, which takes a second or two, but presents me with a list of the storage devices that are available. Now you'll see here, because I configured a local 40 gig disk drive here, I have a single disk that I can use to install ESXi onto. If I want, I can hit the F1 button here to identify more details about this disk. A little later on, we're going to talk about the different ways in which ESXi actually identifies its disk names here. And while this is less important when you have a local disk where there's only a single disk in the machine, when you have multiple disks that may be plugged into this, or remote disks that may be plugged into this from a storage area network, these disk details become important for you to identify the exact disk that you want to install the ESXi binary files onto, the OS files, for example. Now in this case, again, I really don't have to worry about which one it is because there's only one disk that I'm connecting to, so I can choose that disk by default and the US default keyboard layout. I want to punch in my root password and make sure that they match here. You'll see that they do match indeed, and I hit the Enter button, and we'll go through scanning the system. Now at this point, we're probably going to get a little error message that pops up depending on how your configuration exists that talks about whether or not you actually have the hypervisor extensions correctly installed and available in your computer. Here's that little error message. It says hardware virtualization warning, and it notes that hardware virtualization is not a feature of this CPU or is not enabled in the BIOS. Now, you need to make sure if you're running VMware Workstation that you've got the hardware virtualization extensions for your BIOS enabled. And we would have to actually go through and boot into the BIOS and make sure those extensions are enabled. I'm not going to do that here because I actually already have them enabled in my BIOS. Make sure that you enable them and also then power down the machine in order to fully enable those extensions. Now, there is a little bit of a quirky error that occurs here when I'm using VMware Workstation and ESXi on top of VMware Workstation, so I can safely ignore this message for now. But be aware that you may see this error message, and if you do, double check your settings in the BIOS, and if so, go ahead and hit the enter button to continue. You'll notice that it allows me to actually go through and complete the installation even if I get that error message. And this final screen here allows me to choose F11 to complete that install. Now, this installation takes again another 5 or 7 minutes to go about installing ESXi, but that's really all there is. I'll go ahead and pause the recording, and when I come back, we'll have a completely installed ESXi instance. All right, and after another 5 or 7 minutes and a reboot, you can see that we have now another ESXi host, similar to the one that we looked at just a minute ago, that we're ready to use for installing and adding into our vCenter environment. Before we do so, there's a couple settings that are required in order to get the management network and some other minor stuff configured here on ESXi 1. As you can see, first and foremost, we're currently getting an IP address here from DHCP, which we don't want to do. Instead, what we're going to do is down here, choose the F2 button to actually customize the system and take a look at some of the other pieces that are involved here at the console level. Now, once I log in, you see I can configure a password if I want. I should already have that password configured as part of the installation. What's necessary, however, is to configure that management network. You'll see here I have a number of different network adapters. Here are the 3 different network adapters that were installed into this computer from VMware Workstation. And the first one of these, VMNIC 0, is the adapter that we're going to select for the default management network connection. If you have this network card, and this is not an access level network card, but if you're trunking that network card into this host, you may want to instead choose or also choose a VLAN that's associated with this card. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the concept of access layer ports or trunking ports, you can safely kind of ignore this for now, but be aware that your network team may actually give you a single or a pair of network cards that instead of having a single subnet that's assigned to them, have multiple subnets and multiple VLANs that are assigned to them. This is something, again, that will come from your network team. If they do that, they'll probably also provide for you 1 or more VLANs that will be associated with the different subnets that you'll be pulling in. Perhaps there'll be 1 subnet for the storage and 1 subnet for your production networking and another subnet for your management network connection. Now, in this case, these network cards are all access layer cards, and so I'm not going to put a VLAN ID in here now, but if you do have one, you'll want to put one in here for the VLAN that's going to be associated with your management network. Our next task that's required is to actually set up the IP address information for this server. I don't want to use dynamic IP address and network configuration in this case. Instead, I'm going to set this to 192.168.0.202, which is the IP address associated with ESX1 in my network. I'm going to choose a subnet mask here, which is in my case a 24-bit subnet mask and my default gateway. If I have IPv6, I can also choose to enable and then configure my IPv6 configuration down here. Do not forget to set up your DNS configuration as well. In my case, my DNS servers are 192.168.0.100. And the most important piece down here is this host name at the bottom, which identifies the host name not of the DNS server, but of the server that you're actually building right now. In my case, that's esx1.company.pri. A lot of people actually forget that host name and need to actually enter it in later. So make sure that you enter in the host name of this server here, or you're going to actually have to come back and make some changes a little later on. I'll choose the enter button here, and I can choose custom DNS suffixes if I want, for example, company.pri, or if there are other entries that are necessary if I have multiple different DNS suffixes for my network. Once I've done that and I hit the escape button, you'll see that I'm alerted that I need to actually restart the management networks to apply those changes. If I hit the yes button, that'll actually apply those changes and make this server ready to go with the IP address and host name that was just set up. I can choose again to restart that that management network here, or I can choose to test the management network. Now, this test management network link is actually fairly important because you're going to want to actually go through this test to make sure that you have all of your settings set up correctly. It will go through and ping the default gateway and then also the DNS server, and also attempt to resolve the host name for this server, ESX1.company.pri, against the DNS server that you've configured. If I hit the enter button here, you'll see that, well, all right, I got an OK for the default gateway, I got an OK for the DNS server, but I've actually got a failed here for ESX1.company.pri, which means that my DNS server is unaware of this host name. Now, in order to make this test successful, what I need to do is actually go to the DNS tab here. I'll do so here under VC, and bring up that DNS tab so that I can actually enter in the static address for ESX1.company.pri into my DNS zone. You'll see here's ESX2 that's associated with 0.203. At this point, what I want to do is actually add in a new host name for ESX1 that's associated with 192.168.0.202 and create an associated pointer record, a reverse record for ESX1. This is important so that I have the correct resolution of the ESX servers into my DNS. Now, I've got to have all of these servers in DNS or I'm going to end up with some problems a little bit down the road. Once I've entered this into DNS, I can go back to ESX1 and then rerun the test until I make sure that I've got all three of these responding with an OK prompt. That alerts me that I'm going to be successful with getting all the necessary functionalities correct with this server. You see here I've got the host name correctly identified here. It shows OK, which means I'm ready to go. A couple other items here in the list that we'll want to pay attention to. We can restore network settings if we want. I can configure a different keyboard layout if I want. There are some troubleshooting options we'll take a look at a little bit later. Also some system logs we'll take a look at a little bit later. What I want to have you pay particular attention to is this view support information here. This dialog box gives me a lot of information about this ESX host. And the most important of which here, at least for this phase of the game, is the SSL thumbprint, the SHA-1 thumbprint that's been associated with this ESX1 host. This is essentially a random generated SHA-1 thumbprint that uniquely identifies this ESX1 host. And you'll want to actually pay attention to this 07DA-AD information, because as we enter this ESX1 host into our vCenter server, we're going to need to make sure that this SSL thumbprint matches the one that the server we're attempting to connect to from vCenter actually is the same. It's the same string of characters. So be aware of this. We'll come back to this here in just a second. Now, at this point, we've completed all the things that we need to here on the console of our ESX server. The next step is actually to go back here into our vCenter server. This is that vCenter server we've been working with before, and add that ESXi host into vCenter. The first step in doing so is to actually create a data center. A data center is effectively the boundary of administration for all the different hosts that we're going to pull into this particular vCenter server. If I choose New Data Center here, I can give it a name. I'll call it My Data Center. And once I've created that data center, the next step is to actually add in the hosts into the data center. If I right-click and choose New Host, it'll give me the option of selecting what hosts are available. I'll choose ESX1.company.pri, and then the username and password that's associated for logging on into that host. In this case, that'll be root, and then the password that I entered in whenever I installed ESX1. If I choose the next button here, it will show me that it's unable to verify the authenticity of the specified host. And here's the SHA-1 thumbprint that this host is saying that it actually is, 07DA-AD-CD. I want to make sure that that matches here with the SHA-1 thumbprint that the host says it is in this screen as well, 07DA-AD-CD. This seems to be the right host, so I can actually go through and choose yes here. Ensuring this makes sure that I don't have some sort of security hole where some inappropriate person is attempting to spoof the fact that they are indeed ESX1. So this protects me against any kind of man-in-the-middle attack or any kind of real security hole that I might get whenever I complete that initial authorization and authentication to bringing this host into my vCenter server. Choose the next button here. And next again, I can now choose an existing license key to assign to this host. Now I don't actually have license keys here because I'm using evaluation mode, but if I did, I could assign a new license key to this host by selecting the bottom dialog box here and choosing Enter Key. Punch in the license key in here, and that will assign that license key to this ESXi host. I'm running in evaluation mode. I don't need a license key at this point, so I'll choose the top radio button here and choose No License Key. On the next button here, I have lockdown mode. And what lockdown mode is, it provides a way to greatly increase the security posture of the ESXi host that I'm bringing into this vCenter environment. Now, if you think about an ESX host is an instance of the vkernel with some additional wrapper code that will kind of call Linux, because there's not really a better word to use to describe it, but it's not really a true version of Linux. The fact that it is Linux-like means that you could actually open up an SSH connection or a local shell connection to dig into that instance to actually configure and make changes to that host. Now, doing so actually opens up and makes larger the attack surface of that ESXi host. On the other hand, if I wanted to, I could actually involve lockdown mode here, which would lock down that server ESX1 so that the only things it would do, the only actions that it would actually attempt to accomplish, are those that have been specifically instructed by the vCenter server. Now, doing so means that I've reduced the attack surface area of that ESX host and improved my security posture, but doing so also means that I can't actually log in to the Linux-like portion of that ESX host to do some manual configuration. So in this case, I'm going to leave it unenabled, but your security environment or your security policies may require you to enable lockdown mode, because indeed this does actually improve the security posture of the hosts that you're connecting into vCenter. I'll choose the next button here and add this to my data center for the location for storing the host's virtual machines, and click Finish to actually bring this server into the environment. You see down here under Tasks, if I take a look here, it'll show me that I'm attempting to add in a standalone host into the environment. And it's taking about 80% of the way through, and it's retrieving some additional information. Once it's actually completed this process of bringing this host into the environment, I've got a couple of additional configuration steps that are required to get this ESXi host ready to begin hosting virtual machines. And you can see there now it appears that it's completed, and now I have ESX1.company.pri that's now available for me to operate with here in the vSphere client. Let me go over here to the configuration node. Over the next couple of nuggets, we're going to be spending a lot of time here in the configuration node, because each of these hosts needs to be configured across their storage and their networking and their storage adapters and network adapters. All of this other core functionality has to be set up before we can ever go through the process of bringing on virtual machines. Before we even get there, we need to come down to the software node down here and configure a few settings that are important for just the core functionality of ESXi. The first of which here is to verify that we have the most appropriate license features for whatever license that we've actually assigned to this ESXi host. In this case, we have the evaluation mode that we're using, so all of the product features are available to us. Under time configuration, we always want to have these ESXi hosts connected up to some sort of NTP server, whether it be local or on the internet somewhere, because that NTP server is going to provide the appropriate time services for making sure our logs have the right times associated with them. Now you'll see the NTP client here is currently stopped, and we don't have an NTP server that we're connecting to. What I'm going to do here is click the Properties button here and choose to enable the NTP client, and choose Options here, and make sure that I'm going to start and stop with the host, so that the NTP server is automatically going to start when the host starts and then stop whenever the host stops as well. And I need to choose actually an NTP server that I'm going to point against. Again, if you have one local to your environment, you can use that, or you can use one of the ones that are out on the internet, like pool.ntp.org, which is a common one that's being used, and then choose to restart the NTP service to apply those changes. When I hit the OK button here, you'll see that my NTP server is now running, and I'm getting a better time here that's more correct for the server that I'm attempting to work with. There are a whole series of additional software elements that are needed to be configured down here. However, there's only one that's required here at the very beginning of getting this ESXi host up and running, and that's the assurance that we have our DNS and routing information set up correctly. You can see here that I have my name as ESX1 and the domain of company.pri. I currently have a static DNS server of 192.168.0.100. My search domains are company.pri, and I have a default gateway for the VM kernel of 0.1. If any of these were incorrect, I could choose the Properties button up here to adjust some of the information here. This is for DNS configuration under the first tab and for routing here under the second tab. These are all correct because I've entered them in appropriately whenever I was doing the initial configuration of ESXi back in the ESXi console. So this really concludes the initial configuration of that ESXi host here inside of vCenter. So what have we talked about this nugget? We've talked about the installation and the initial configuration of a VMware ESXi host. We went through the process of installing and completing that configuration and verifying the thumbprint. We created a data center and added that host into vCenter server. We talked a little bit about lockdown mode and some of those very initial settings you have to be aware of, and also what the steps are you need to actually license that ESXi host. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.